John Wallace, a billionaire known for his business acumen, stepped out of his sleek black limousine into the vibrant city night. The event he had just attended was meant to be an opportunity to network, but he had found it stifling, filled with shallow conversations and forced smiles. Wanting a breath of fresh air, he decided to walk a few blocks to clear his mind before meeting his driver at a less crowded location. The streets glimmered under the soft glow of streetlights, the faint hum of the city enveloping him. He took a shortcut through a dimly lit alley, thinking it would be faster. As he turned a corner, the atmosphere shifted. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. Before he could reconsider his path, three figures emerged from the darkness. Their faces carried a mix of aggression and opportunism, and their intentions were unmistakable. "Well, look who wandered into the wrong neighborhood," sneered the tallest of the group, his voice dripping with mockery. John's heart began to race, but he kept his expression composed. He had faced countless boardroom battles and hostile negotiations, but this was different. These men weren't here to talk deals. They were predators, and he was their prey. "What do you want?" he'd asked, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Everything, rich boy," one of them spat, stepping closer. "Your watch, your wallet, and maybe a little extra for wasting our time." John's mind raced, calculating his next move. He wasn't carrying much cash, but the luxury watch on his wrist alone was worth more than most people's yearly salary. Before he could speak, a sharp voice cut through the tense silence. "The police are on their way. I suggest you leave while you still can." The group turned in unison, their confidence wavering. At the far end of the alley stood a young woman, her small frame outlined against the faint glow of a distant streetlight. She held a rusted metal pipe in her hands, gripping it tightly. Her clothes were tattered, her face marked by the hardships of life on the streets, but her stance was firm, her gaze unwavering. "And who are you supposed to be?" the leader growled, trying to mask his hesitation with bravado. "I'm the person who just saved you from making a big mistake," she replied, her voice calm but firm. One of the men lunged toward her, attempting to snatch the pipe. With surprising speed, she swung it, striking his arm with enough force to make him yelp in pain. "I called the cops," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "You've got about 30 seconds to disappear." A distant wail of sirens, faint but distinct, sealed the deal. The leader hesitated, his bravado crumbling as he exchanged nervous glances with his companions. "Let's go," he muttered reluctantly, his voice filled with frustration. "This isn't over." The three men melted into the shadows, leaving John standing alone in stunned silence. The young woman lowered the pipe, her grip relaxing as she let out a breath she had been holding. John took a cautious step toward her, his mind still reeling from the sudden turn of events. "Did you really call the police?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. She gave him a faint smile, a flicker of amusement dancing in her tired eyes. "No, I don't even have a phone, but they didn't need to know that." John stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or feel indebted. This stranger, with nothing but sheer courage and quick thinking, had just saved him from a potentially life-threatening situation. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Don't mention it," she replied, already turning to leave. "Just be more careful about where you walk." "Wait," he called out, taking another step toward her. She stopped, turning to face him with a look that was equal parts curiosity and wariness. "At least tell me your name," he said. She hesitated, studying him for a moment before answering. "Lila." "Lila," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Let me help you. I owe you." Her gaze hardened slightly, a flicker of pride flashing across her face. "I didn't do it for money. And even if I did, I doubt you could give me what I really need." "Then tell me," he pressed, his curiosity piqued. "What do you need?" She let out a soft laugh, more bitter than amused. "A new life. But I don't think that's something you can offer." John frowned, her words resonating more deeply than he expected. Without thinking, he pulled a sleek business card from his pocket and extended it toward her. If you ever change your mind, call me. She eyed the card warily, as if it was some kind of trap, before finally reaching out and taking it. Her fingers brushed against his for the briefest moment, and he caught a glimpse of the exhaustion etched into her face. Maybe I will, she said quietly, slipping the card into her pocket before disappearing into the night. As she walked away, John remained rooted to the spot, the echoes of her words lingering in his mind. Something about her, the strength in her voice, the sadness in her eyes, stirred a feeling he couldn't quite name. He didn't know it yet, but this fleeting encounter would change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. 2 days had passed since the encounter in the alley, yet Lila's face and voice lingered in John Wallace's mind. For someone who prided himself on his rationality, he found himself deeply unsettled by how much he was thinking about her. It wasn't just gratitude for saving him. There was something about her confidence and resilience that struck a chord. John sat in his sprawling office, the city skyline stretching out before him through floor-to-ceiling windows. He tried to focus on the stack of reports on his desk, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the card he handed her. What were the chances she'd actually call? He wondered. His musings were interrupted by a buzz from his intercom. Mr. Wallace. His receptionist's voice came through, professional but tinged with curiosity. There's a woman here to see you. She says you know her. John's heart skipped a beat. Send her up, he replied, his voice calm despite the sudden surge of anticipation. Minutes later, the elevator doors slid open, and there she was, Lila. She was cleaner than the last time he'd seen her, her tangled hair now brushed, her face free of grime. She wore a plain shirt and jeans, clothes that looked borrowed or hastily purchased, but they couldn't hide the tiredness in her eyes or the guarded expression on her face. I can't believe I'm here, she began, stepping into his office with measured hesitation. But I didn't have a choice. I need your help. John stood from behind his desk, his curiosity deepening. Please sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She hesitated for a moment before lowering herself into the chair, her posture stiff, her hands clutching the strap of a worn-out bag slung over her shoulder. I'm not here to ask for charity, she said firmly, but you told me to call if I ever needed something, so here I am. What do you need? He asked, his tone neutral, though he could sense the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. She exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. A job, something stable, something that can help me start over. John studied her for a moment, his instincts kicking in. She wasn't like most people who walked into his office asking for favors. There was no pretense, no sugarcoating, just raw honesty, and a flicker of desperation she was trying to keep hidden. Do you have any work experience? He asked, leaning back in his chair. She shook her head. Not the kind you care about. But I learn fast, and I'm not afraid of hard work. The corners of his mouth twitched upward in the faintest hint of a smile. He appreciated her directness. You know, he said, steepling his fingers, hiring someone with no experience is a risk. Why should I take it? Because I saved your life, she replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. And because you told me to call. Her answer caught him off guard, and for the first time in a while, John found himself genuinely amused. Fair enough, he said, leaning forward. I have an opening for a personal assistant. The job isn't glamorous, organizing schedules, handling appointments, attending events with me. Think you can handle it? Lila blinked, clearly surprised. She hadn't expected him to take her seriously, let alone offer her a position with responsibility. You're serious? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I don't waste my time making jokes, he replied. She bit her lip, her expression shifting as she weighed the offer. Why are you doing this? She asked finally. You don't even know me. Because you have courage, he said simply. And because I'm curious to see where it can take you. Lila stared at him, her guarded demeanor cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of uncertainty. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll take it. Good, John said, standing and extending his hand. You start tomorrow at 7 a.m. sharp. She stood as well, shaking his hand firmly. I'll be here, she promised, her voice steadier now. As she turned to leave, John called out to her, Lila. She paused, glancing back at him. Don't make me regret this. A faint smile played on her lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. I won't. And with that, she was gone, leaving John to wonder yet again why this woman had managed to make such an impression on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something in motion, something that would challenge both of them in ways neither could yet imagine. The next morning, Lila arrived at John Wallace's office building at exactly 6:45 a.m. She stood in the grand lobby, her eyes scanning the space with a mix of awe and trepidation. The polished marble floors, towering glass walls, and the steady hum of sharply dressed professionals made her feel out of place in her second-hand clothes. Still, she reminded herself of the promise she'd made. She wouldn't let him regret this. At the reception desk, she introduced herself. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a practiced smile, raised an eyebrow when Lila gave her name, but remained polite. Mr. Wallace is expecting you. I'll let him know you're here, she said, pressing a button on her headset. A moment later, Lila was escorted to the elevator and sent to the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, John was already waiting. He stood by his office door, a cup of coffee in hand, dressed in a tailored suit that looked effortless yet commanding. He gave her a quick once-over, noting her punctuality and the faint trace of nervousness she tried to hide. You're early, he remarked, stepping aside to let her enter. You said 7 a.m. sharp, she replied, her voice steady. Figured it wouldn't hurt to be here a little before. Good, I like that, he said, motioning for her to follow. Let's get started. He led her to a small desk just outside his office. It was simple but equipped with a computer, a planner, and a neatly organized tray of supplies. This will be your workstation, he explained. Your first task is to familiarize yourself with my schedule for the week and ensure everything is in order. I'll need you to confirm appointments, rearrange a few meetings, and send out updates to my team. Lila nodded, already scanning the planner. Got it. As she sat down and began working, John observed her from his office. She was focused, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she navigated through his calendar with surprising ease. Despite her lack of corporate experience, she had a natural ability to organize and prioritize, a skill that John knew couldn't be taught. Around mid-morning, one of the senior managers, a sharp-eyed man named David, stopped by his office. New hire? David asked, gesturing toward Lila. Yes, John replied without elaboration. David frowned slightly, his gaze lingering on her. Interesting choice. She doesn't exactly look the part. John's expression hardened. I didn't hire her to fit a mold, David. I hired her to do the job. David held up his hands in mock surrender. Just an observation. John said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he watched David walk away. He knew there would be whispers about Lila, questions about why he'd brought her into the company. But he didn't care. His instincts told him she had potential, and he wasn't about to let office gossip deter him. As the day went on, Lila proved his instincts right. She quickly grasped the nuances of the job, asking smart questions when needed and handling tasks with precision. By lunchtime, she had already reorganized his entire week, smoothed over a scheduling conflict, and prepared a summary of key meetings. Still, John couldn't help but notice the subtle barrier she kept up. She spoke professionally but rarely made eye contact, and there was a quiet tension in her posture that suggested she was always on guard. It intrigued him, this mystery she carried, but he knew better than to pry. For now, he was content to let her settle into the role. During lunch, John found her in the break room, sitting alone at a small table near the window. She was eating a simple sandwich she'd brought from home, her gaze fixed on the bustling city below. You don't take breaks, do you? He asked, walking over with his own plate of food. She glanced up, surprised to see him there. I figured I'd keep busy. Isn't that what you're paying me for? True, he said, sitting across from her. But even the most driven people need a moment to recharge. Lila shrugged. I'm used to keeping busy. Sitting still doesn't feel right. John studied her for a moment, noting the guarded look in her eyes. You've had a tough life, haven't you? He asked, his tone softer than usual. She stiffened slightly, her gaze dropping to her sandwich. You could say that. He didn't press further, sensing her discomfort. Instead, he changed the subject. You did well this morning. Better than I expected. Thanks, she said simply, though there was a flicker of pride in her voice. As the day wound to a close, Lila remained at her desk, organizing notes and responding to emails. By the time she finally stood to leave, the office was nearly empty. John walked her to the elevator, a rare gesture for someone of his status. Good first day, he said as the doors opened. Keep it up. I will, she replied, stepping inside. For the first time, she looked him in the eye. Thank you for giving me a chance. John nodded, watching as the doors closed. He couldn't explain it, but he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Lila's journey was far from over, and he suspected that their paths were now more entwined than either of them realized. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tasks, challenges, and subtle revelations. Lila quickly adapted to her new role, proving herself to be more than capable of handling John's demanding schedule. She was resourceful, efficient, and unflinchingly honest, traits that earned her grudging respect from even the most skeptical members of John's staff. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. The corporate world had its own unspoken rules, and Lila, with her unpolished demeanor and direct approach, often found herself at odds with the expectations around her. Whispers followed her in the hallways, quiet judgments that stung despite her best efforts to ignore them. Yet she never let it show. She kept her head down and did her work, determined not to give anyone a reason to doubt her. One particularly challenging morning, John called her into his office. His tone was neutral, but there was a weight to his words that made her uneasy. Lila, close the door and sit down. She complied, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her chest. John leaned back in his chair, studying her. Not wrong exactly, but I've noticed something. You're doing excellent work, but you're keeping everyone at arm's length. Lila's jaw tightened. I'm here to do my job, not make friends. True, John agreed. But relationships matter in this world, whether you like it or not. People want to know who they're working with, and right now, you're a mystery to everyone. Maybe that's for the best, she replied, her tone sharp. John raised an eyebrow. Why? What are you so afraid they'll find out? The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For a moment, Lila considered getting up and walking out, but something in John's gaze stopped her. He wasn't mocking her or prying out of curiosity. He genuinely wanted to understand. I've learned the hard way not to trust people, she said finally, her voice quieter now. It's easier to keep to yourself, safer. John nodded slowly. I get that. But if you're going to survive here, you need to let people in, at least a little. Otherwise, they'll fill in the blanks themselves. And trust me, it won't work in your favor. Lila didn't respond, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. She hated how much his words resonated, how they hit on truths she wasn't ready to confront. Think about it, John said, his tone softer. I'm not asking you to spill your life story. Just let people see that you belong here. Because you do. The conversation stayed with her as she returned to her desk. She didn't want to admit it, but John had a point. The walls she built around herself had kept her safe for so long, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to let a crack form. Later that day, an opportunity presented itself. A team meeting was called to prepare for a high-profile event John would be attending that weekend. Lila, as his assistant, was tasked with organizing the details. The room was filled with senior staff, most of whom barely acknowledged her presence. As the meeting began, the team stumbled into a debate over the venue arrangements. Lila had been quiet up until this point, but as the discussion grew more heated, she found herself speaking up. Why not combine the two seating plans? She suggested, her voice cutting through the noise. You'll get the exclusivity you want for the VIPs without alienating the rest of the guests. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, and for a brief moment, she regretted opening her mouth. But John, seated at the head of the table, gave her a small nod of encouragement. That's actually a good idea, one of the managers admitted reluctantly. We hadn't considered that. Lila felt a mix of relief and pride. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. For the first time, she'd spoken up and been heard. After the meeting, as she gathered her notes, one of the junior staff members approached her. That was a great suggestion, he said with a friendly smile. You've got a good head for this. Thanks, Lila replied, surprised by the genuine kindness in his tone. As the day wound down, Lila found herself reflecting on the small moments that had started to shift her perspective. Maybe letting people in wasn't as dangerous as she thought. Maybe there was room for trust after all. When she left the office that evening, John was waiting by the elevator, an unusual gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed. Good work today, he said as they waited for the doors to open. You're starting to find your footing. I guess, she replied, her tone modest. Still figuring it out? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You're doing better than you think. As the elevator doors closed, Lila couldn't help but feel a faint sense of hope. For the first time in years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she belonged. The next few weeks marked a turning point for Lila. She began to establish herself within the company, not just as John's assistant, but as someone whose ideas carried weight. The tentative connections she had started building grew stronger, and the whispers in the hallways gradually faded into something else: respect. One Friday evening, as most of the staff hurried out for the weekend, John called Lila into his office. She stepped inside, noticing a pile of folders on his desk. He gestured for her to sit. We've got a big opportunity coming up, he began, sliding a folder toward her. It's a joint venture with a major tech company, the kind of deal that could reshape the future of our business. Lila opened the folder, scanning the preliminary plans. Looks ambitious, she said, her voice thoughtful. It is, John replied, and I need someone I can trust to help me prepare. That's where you come in. Lila's eyes flickered with surprise. Me? Yes, you, John said firmly. You've shown me you can handle pressure, think creatively, and adapt. This is your chance to prove you're more than just an assistant. She hesitated, her mind racing. The stakes were high, and she wasn't sure she was ready. But the look in John's eyes, the confidence he had in her, gave her pause. What would you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt. Research, strategy, and most importantly, perspective, John said. You've got a way of seeing things differently, and I think that could be our edge. Lila nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. Good, he said with a small smile. We start Monday. Over the weekend, Lila poured herself into the project, reading every document John had given her and researching the companies involved. By the time Monday morning rolled around, she felt a mix of exhaustion and excitement. Their first planning session was intense. The conference room was filled with senior executives, all eager to impress John with their ideas. Lila, seated next to him, felt the weight of their skepticism. But as the meeting progressed, she found herself speaking up more than once, offering insights that surprised even the most seasoned members of the team. When the meeting ended, John turned to her, a hint of pride in his expression. You did well, he said simply. Thanks, she replied, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. But the real challenge came later that week, when John asked her to attend a networking event with him. It's a chance to meet some of the key players, he explained. And I want you there. People need to see you as part of the team. The idea made Lila nervous. She wasn't used to the glitz and glamour of corporate events, and the thought of mingling with powerful executives was daunting. But she nodded, knowing this was another step in proving herself. The night of the event, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple but elegant dress John had arranged for her. When she arrived at the venue, she felt the weight of eyes on her, some curious, others skeptical. John greeted her at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "You clean up well," he said with a smirk, offering her his arm. "Thanks," she replied, trying to hide her nerves. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The room buzzed with conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the subtle undercurrent of ambition. John introduced her to key figures. Each exchanged a delicate dance of words and impressions. At one point, she found herself speaking with a senior executive from the tech company involved in the joint venture. He'd asked her opinion on a particular aspect of the project, and she'd answered honestly, drawing from the research she'd done. When the executive smiled and nodded in approval, John, standing nearby, gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. As the night wore on, Lila began to relax. She even managed to share a laugh with a few of John's colleagues, her confidence growing with each interaction. When the event finally ended, John walked her to the car waiting outside. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. "Thanks," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "I wasn't sure how you'd do," he admitted. "But you surprised me." Lila glanced at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I guess I'm full of surprises." As the car pulled away, she leaned back against the seat, her thoughts racing. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly on the cusp of something meaningful. But as much as she tried to focus on the progress she'd made, a small, nagging voice reminded her that the past she'd worked so hard to escape still lingered in the shadows, waiting for its moment to resurface. And when it did, she wasn't sure if all the progress in the world would be enough to protect her. The weeks that followed the event were a whirlwind of progress and pressure. Lila's involvement in the joint venture solidified her place in the company. Her insights continued to impress not only John but also the senior executives who had once dismissed her as an outsider. Yet, as her professional life soared, cracks in her carefully constructed facade began to show. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal in John's office, he noticed her growing silence. She had been unusually quiet, her focus drifting despite the important task at hand. "Lila," John said, his tone sharp enough to pull her back. "What's going on? You're not yourself today." She blinked, shaking her head slightly. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're not," he pressed, "and I don't need distractions with this deal so close. If something's wrong, you need to tell me." Her grip tightened on the papers in her hands, and for a moment, it seemed like she might dismiss him again. But then she sighed, setting the proposal down. "It's nothing to do with the deal," she admitted. "It's personal, and it's nothing you need to worry about." John's gaze softened, though his persistence didn't waver. "If it's affecting your work, it's my concern. Talk to me." For a moment, she hesitated, her walls threatening to crumble under his steady gaze. Finally, she looked away. "There's someone from my past," she said quietly. "Someone I've been trying to avoid, but they've found me." John frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of someone?" Lila hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the proposal. "Someone who doesn't like to let go of old debts," she said, her tone bitter. John leaned back in his chair, processing her words. "Are you in trouble?" "Not yet," she replied. "But I might be, and I don't want it to spill into my work here." He studied her, the sharp instincts that had guided his business decisions now fixated on her. "Have they contacted you?" She nodded reluctantly. "A letter. No return address, just a warning." John's expression darkened. "You should have told me sooner." "It's my problem," she said firmly. "I don't need anyone fighting my battles for me." "Lila, you work for me," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "If you're in danger, it's not just your problem anymore." His words hung in the air, challenging her independence in a way that made her both angry and oddly comforted. "I'll handle it," she said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction she usually carried. John didn't push her further, but his expression made it clear he wasn't going to let it drop. "Just know you're not alone in this," he said. Later that evening, as Lila left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The city streets, once a place of relative anonymity, now felt suffocating. She tightened her coat around herself, her eyes darting toward every shadow as she made her way home. When she reached her apartment, a note was waiting for her on the door. It was scrawled in messy handwriting, the words sending a chill down her spine. Asterisk, we're not done, Lila. You can't run forever. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she pulled the note down, crumpling it into her pocket. A mix of fear and anger surged through her. She had worked too hard to rebuild her life, and she wasn't about to let her past drag her back down. The next morning, she walked into John's office, the crumpled note in her hand. Without a word, she placed it on his desk. He glanced at the note, his expression hardening as he read it. Whoever this is, they're escalating, he said. I told you, I'll handle it, Lila said, though her voice wavered. And I told you, you're not alone, he countered. We'll deal with this together. Lila stared at him, her defenses faltering under the weight of his resolve. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the faintest glimmer of trust. Okay, she said softly, but no police, not yet. John nodded, understanding her hesitation. Fine, but we take precautions. Whoever this is, they don't get to dictate how you live your life. As Lila left his office, she felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The storm she had tried so hard to outrun was catching up to her, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. As the days passed, Lila's life at the company seemed to move in two very different directions. One outward, full of confidence and competence in her role, and one inward, grappling with the looming threat from her past. The joint venture was progressing smoothly under her guidance, and her colleagues began to see her not just as John's assistant, but as a vital part of the team's success. Yet the fear of her past returning was always at the back of her mind. One morning, as Lila was reviewing the final draft of a presentation for the upcoming board meeting, John walked into her office. She looked up, her concentration broken by his sudden appearance. Lila, he said, closing the door behind him, his tone serious. We need to talk. She nodded, pushing her chair back and gesturing for him to take a seat. About the presentation, she asked, though she knew it wasn't just about that. John took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair, as if preparing himself for a difficult conversation. No, not about the presentation, he replied. I'm talking about what's going on with you. You're still not telling me everything. Lila glanced away, focusing on the window for a moment before letting out a long breath. I'm trying to protect you, she said quietly. I don't want you to get involved in this. Too late for that, John replied, his voice calm but firm. You know I don't back down from a fight. Whatever this is, it's affecting you, and that means it affects me too. She hesitated, biting her lip. I've been getting more letters, she admitted finally, the words spilling out almost against her will. They're getting bolder. Do they know where you live? John asked, his expression hardening at the thought. I don't think so, she replied, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. But they're getting closer. Do you know who it is? John pressed, his gaze intense. Lila shook her head. Not for sure, but I have a feeling. And it's not just someone from my past, it's someone I can't outrun. John's expression softened, the steely determination giving way to concern. You don't have to do this alone, Lila, he said gently. We'll figure this out together. For a moment, Lila's eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and gratitude. She wanted to believe him, to trust that she wasn't alone in this. But years of independence and survival had left her wary of anyone getting too close. I don't know how you can help, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. By being here, John replied simply. By making sure you don't face this alone. Lila looked down at the papers on her desk, her hands trembling slightly. What if it's too much? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. What if I can't? Then we figure it out together, he said, his tone firm, his gaze unwavering. I've faced worse challenges in business, Lila, And I know how to protect what matters. The words seemed to settle something inside her. For the first time, Lila felt the weight she'd been carrying lift just a little. It was the first step toward letting someone else into her life. Letting someone else share the burden. Okay, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. But I need to be the one to call the shots. Agreed, John said, his gaze steady. You're the boss when it comes to this. But no, you're not alone. As the day progressed, Lila threw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind off the threats. But that night, as she walked back to her apartment, she felt it again, eyes on her, following her down the dimly lit streets. Her pace quickened, heart pounding, and she could barely breathe by the time she reached her building. Once inside, she locked the door behind her, leaning against it and letting out a shaky breath. She knew she couldn't keep living in fear, but every time she tried to take a step forward, it felt like the past was waiting to drag her back. The next morning, John was waiting for her outside her building when she left for work. He nodded silently as she approached, his expression unreadable. Ready? He asked simply. Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, let's go. Their ride to the office was quiet, each lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, John insisted on walking her to her office door, his presence a reassuring shield against the world outside. Don't take any chances today, he said softly, his hand on her shoulder. I'll be keeping an eye on things. Lila nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest that was foreign but welcome. Thanks, John, she said softly, before taking a deep breath and stepping inside her office. As the day unfolded, Lila's focus was sharper than ever. She worked through the presentation, edited the final details, and prepared for the board meeting with an intensity she hadn't shown before. She knew that every word, every decision mattered now more than ever. Her past was knocking louder on the door, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. By the time the meeting rolled around, Lila felt the familiar tension in her stomach. She walked into the boardroom with her head held high, every nerve on edge. John gave her a reassuring nod as she took her seat next to him, and she took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. The presentation went smoothly, and the board responded positively to her suggestions. But as the meeting ended, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. The walls she had built were crumbling, and the past was threatening to overwhelm her. At the end of the day, John found her sitting at her desk, her eyes distant as if looking through a fog. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression serious. What are you thinking? He'd asked quietly. Lila shook her head, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Just trying to figure out how to survive this, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. You don't have to do it alone, he replied, his tone softening. We'll figure it out together. Lila looked up at him, feeling the tears gather in her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could leave her past behind and move forward. I believe you, she said softly. Thank you, John. John stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. Anytime, he said simply, before extending his hand to her. Let's figure this out together, Lila. One step at a time. As the days went by, Lila and John's collaboration grew stronger. They worked seamlessly together, each feeding off the other's strengths. The company's projects were progressing smoothly, and Lila's reputation within the company soared. But the shadow from her past remained, lurking just beyond her periphery, waiting for an opportunity to strike. One evening, after another successful day at work, John found Lila sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen, as if it held the answers to her problems. The office was mostly empty, the lights dimmed as employees prepared to leave for the night. Lila, John's voice was gentle as he approached her. Are you okay? She looked up at him, a forced smile on her face. Just tired, she replied, her voice weary. Long day. John took the seat across from her, his expression concerned. It's more than just a long day, isn't it? He pressed. Lila hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, it is, she admitted, her eyes darkening. They're getting more aggressive, John. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Have you heard from them? John asked, his tone even as he watched her closely. Lila hesitated again before shaking her head. Not directly, she said finally. But I know they're watching me. I can feel it. Is it the same person? John's voice was low, almost a whisper, or different threats. I don't know, Lila replied, her frustration clear. It's like they're everywhere, closing in from all sides. John reached across the desk, placing a reassuring hand on her own. We're not going to let them win, he said softly. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way to stop them. Lila looked down at their joined hands, her throat tightening as the tears filled her eyes. I don't want to drag you into this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I chose to be here, Lila, John replied, his tone steady. And I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, Lila simply held his gaze, as if trying to find the courage she needed in his eyes. Thank you, she said finally, her voice breaking, for not giving up on me. Never, John said, his grip on her hand tightening. We'll face this together, no matter what. As the silence between them stretched on, Lila knew that John was right. She couldn't face this alone. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear, hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to put her past behind her and move forward. Okay, she said softly, her voice steadying. Let's do this. Together. John gave her a reassuring smile, his grip on her hand loosening as he rose from his chair. Good. Now let's make a plan. Lila nodded, taking a deep breath as she pushed away the fear that had been weighing on her. Together, they began to outline their strategy, researching potential threats, gathering information, and reaching out to people who might be able to help. It was a daunting task, but with John by her side, Lila felt a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. Step by step, John said, his voice steady and sure. We'll figure this out. As they worked through the details, Lila felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting alone. John was there with her, sharing the burden and offering a sense of security that she had been missing for too long. The next morning, they arrived at the office early, ready to start implementing their plan. John had taken steps to increase security around the building, extra guards, surveillance cameras, and even a private investigator to track down any clues about who was targeting Lila. Today, we take back control, John said as they settled into his office, his tone resolute. No more waiting, no more hiding. Lila nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady as she pulled out her laptop and began to organize their plan. As the day wore on, they followed through on their strategy, gathering information, interviewing witnesses, and checking for any possible connections between Lila's past and the threats she was receiving. The work was exhausting, but with John's guidance and support, Lila felt stronger with every step. By the end of the day, they had made progress, gathering leads, establishing safe houses, and setting up communication channels to monitor any further threats. As they walked to their separate cars, John gave her a reassuring pat on the back. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice low but confident. We'll keep going until we've got this figured out. Lila managed a tired smile, feeling a sense of relief in his words. Thanks, John, she said softly. For everything. Anytime, he replied with a nod, before heading off to his own car. As she drove home that night, Lila's mind was spinning with everything they had discussed and accomplished. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance to break free from her past, thanks to John's unwavering support. And as she pulled into her apartment building, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could finally leave the past behind and start fresh. As the weeks passed, Lila and John's efforts to protect her from the threats of her past began to take shape. With each passing day, their plan became more refined, and the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place. They worked tirelessly, keeping in constant contact, sharing information, and making sure every step was carefully coordinated. Despite the progress, There was always the lurking fear that they might miss something, that they might not be quick enough to stop whatever was coming. One evening, as John and Lila were reviewing a new set of surveillance footage, John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as he tried to make sense of the latest images. Lila sat across from him, her expression focused as she scanned through the footage on her laptop screen. "Any new leads?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fatigue in her eyes. John shook his head, frustration clear in his eyes. "Nothing concrete," he replied, his tone grim. "Whoever this is, they're good at covering their tracks." Lila leaned back, running a hand through her hair. "It feels like we're walking in circles," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we miss something important?" "We won't," John said firmly, his gaze steady. "We just have to keep looking, keep digging until we find something that makes sense." They were silent for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the computer. John broke the silence, his tone softening as he looked across the desk at her. "Lila, if it gets too much, if you need a break, just tell me. I can handle things for a bit." Lila met his gaze, her eyes searching his as if looking for something solid to hold on to. "I don't know if I can ever really get away from this," she said finally, her voice tinged with resignation. "You can," John replied, his voice gentle but firm. "We're not stopping until we find the answers you need." She nodded, taking a deep breath as she pushed away the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. "Okay," she said softly. Sometimes it feels like I'm never going to be free." "Then we make it happen," John replied, his voice filled with determination. "One step at a time, Lila. We're not giving up." As the night wore on, they continued to work, piecing together information from various sources, tracking down leads, and keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of the person who was haunting Lila. It was exhausting, the tension between them thick as they tried to balance the need for urgency with the need for caution. By the time the early morning hours rolled around, they had made some progress, finding a potential link between the threats and Lila's past, something that hadn't been on their radar before. It was a breakthrough, a small step forward in their quest to find the person who was targeting her. "Okay," John said, his voice low as he leaned back in his chair, looking over the information spread out on his desk. "This is something. We need to follow this lead and see where it takes us." Lila nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We can do this, John," she said, her voice steady as she stood up and began to gather the papers and documents they had been working with. "We'll get through this," John replied, rising to his feet and walking over to where she was standing. Together, as they left the office and made their way to their cars, Lila couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that John was there, that she didn't have to face this alone. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't experienced in years, and it gave her the courage to keep going. The following day, they followed up on the new lead, tracking down a contact who had worked with Lila years before, hoping for information that might help them identify the person threatening her. It was a long shot, but they had to try. John drove them to a small cafe in a quiet part of town, a place Lila had chosen for its anonymity. As they stepped inside, she felt a flutter of nerves. Seeing someone from her past always brought a mix of emotions, fear among them. "Stay close," John murmured as they found a table near the back of the cafe, his eyes scanning the room for anything suspicious. Lila nodded, taking a deep breath as she glanced at her watch. "She should be here any minute," she said quietly, her hands resting nervously in her lap. John reached across the table, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We've got this," he said softly. "No matter what happens, we're in this together." Lila managed a weak smile, grateful for his steady presence. "Thanks, John," she whispered, before turning her attention back to the door. The minutes ticked by, the cafe filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of cups and saucers. Then finally, Lila's phone buzzed with a message. It was her contact, confirming she was on her way. As the door opened and a familiar face appeared, Lila's heart raced. The woman who had once been a mentor, who had taught Lila everything she knew about surviving on the streets. looked exactly the same as she had all those years ago, tired, weary, but still with that glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Lila," the woman said, her voice low as she approached their table. "It's been a long time." "Too long," Lila replied, her voice catching as she stood up and hugged her old friend. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." "Anything for you, Lila," the woman said, her gaze shifting to John. "And who's this?" John extended his hand, giving the woman a reassuring smile. "John Wick," he said, his tone confident. "Lila's business partner. We're here because we need your help." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right," she said finally, sitting down across from them. "What do you need to know?" Lila and John spent the next hour asking questions, digging for information about their mysterious stalker and any connections to Lila's past. The woman, whose name was Sarah, was hesitant at first, but eventually began to open up, sharing stories and details that only someone who had known Lila back then would remember. As the conversation went on, Lila felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because they were finally getting some answers, and sadness because it was clear just how much of her past she had buried away. By the time they finished, they had a few leads to follow. Names, places, and connections that could help them track down the person who was targeting Lila. As they left the cafe, John pulled Lila aside, his expression serious. "We're getting closer," he said quietly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Keep that in mind." Lila nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Thank you, John," she said softly, her voice steady. "For everything." "Anytime," he replied with a smile, before leading her out to his car. "Let's keep going, one step at a time." As Lila and John drove away from the cafe, the weight of the past seemed to settle heavily on both of their shoulders. The information they had gathered felt like a small but crucial piece of the puzzle they were trying to put together. With the leads in hand, they knew the next steps were critical. Every choice they made could bring them closer to finding the truth or lead them further into the shadows. John drove them back to his office in silence, the only sound the steady hum of the car's engine. Lila stared out the window, lost in thought, her mind racing with all the possible connections they had uncovered. "John," she said finally, her voice low, "what if we can't find them? What if this is just a dead end?" "We won't give up," John replied, his voice steady. "As long as we're together, we'll keep pushing forward." They arrived at the office, the lights still on, the building silent now that most employees had gone home for the day. John parked the car and turned to face Lila, his expression serious. "Let's go over what we know," he said, his tone calm. "We need to make a plan." They spent the next hour going through the leads they had gathered, cross-referencing names, checking addresses, and trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Lila was meticulous in her work, scanning through documents and making notes on her laptop, her determination unwavering. "Here," she said finally, pointing to a set of addresses on the screen. "These are the places we need to look. If there's anything left to find, it's got to be there." John leaned in closer, studying the addresses. "Okay," he said slowly, "we should check them out, one by one. No half measures, no assumptions." Lila nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the keyboard as she pulled up maps and directions. "We'll start with the closest one tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "If nothing pans out, we move on." John placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're strong, Lila," he said softly. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping now." Lila gave a weak smile, feeling a knot of tension ease just a little. "Thanks, John," she said, her voice trembling, "for believing in me." "Always," John replied, his tone firm. "Now let's get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As they left the office, the weight of their mission seemed heavier than ever, but so did the sense of hope. Lila was finally allowing herself to hope again, hope that they would find the answers she needed, that she could break free from the past that had haunted her for so long. The next morning, Lila and John set out early, armed with maps, directions, and a renewed sense of determination. The first location was an old warehouse on the edge of town, a place that Lila recognized from her past, a place where she had once been forced to spend a long, terrifying night. As they approached, Lila felt a chill run down her spine. This was it, the place where the answers could finally be waiting. "Ready?" John asked, his voice low as they parked the car and got out. Lila nodded, her gaze fixed on the warehouse in the distance. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady. They made their way to the entrance, John's hand resting on his sidearm just in case. The building was dark and foreboding, the silence inside almost deafening as they pushed open the heavy metal door. The interior was empty, the echo of their footsteps the only sound. Lila walked cautiously through the space, scanning the floor and the corners for any sign of movement. John stayed close behind her, his eyes on the shadows, ready to react if necessary. As they explored the warehouse, Lila began to feel a strange sense of déjà vu. The layout was similar to other places from her past, the echoes of her memories haunting her. It was as if the past had come to life around her, every creak of the building's structure sending a jolt through her. "Nothing," John said finally, his voice low as he joined Lila by the entrance. "I don't think we're going to find anything here." Lila nodded, taking a deep breath as she looked around one last time. "Okay," she said softly. "Next place." The second location was an old apartment building on the other side of town, a place where Lila had once lived for a few months when she had been running from her past. As they approached, Lila's heart began to race. This was where she had felt the safest, and also where she had been betrayed. "Ready?" John asked again, his tone calm as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Yeah," Lila replied, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her eyes. They found the door to the old apartment, Lila's old home, still locked. John reached into his bag, pulling out a set of lockpicks he had brought with them. It took a few tries, but soon the door swung open, revealing a space that was just as Lila had left it years before, dusty, empty, and filled with the remnants of a life she had long since left behind. Lila stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room as memories flooded back, moments of fear, of loneliness, of longing for something better. She walked through the space, touching the walls, the furniture, anything that might trigger a memory, a clue. "Lila," John's voice was gentle as he joined her in the apartment, his gaze on her face. "Anything?" Lila shook her head, her eyes filling with tears as she looked around. "Nothing," she said, her voice breaking. "Just memories." John wrapped an arm around her, holding her close for a moment before leading her back outside. "It's okay," he said softly. "We've still got one more place to check." As they made their way to the final location, Lila felt a sense of resignation. The hope that had been building in her over the past few weeks seemed to be slipping away. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. John wouldn't let her. The final location was a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far from where Lila had grown up. And as they pulled up outside, Lila's heart began to pound. This was it, the last chance to find answers. They approached the front door, John knocking firmly 3 times before stepping back to let Lila take the lead. She took a deep breath, raising her hand to knock. But before she could, the door swung open. "Lila," a familiar voice said, and Lila froze. The man standing in the doorway was someone she had hoped never to see again. "We need to talk." Lila swallowed, her heart racing as she looked from the man to John, who was standing protectively at her side. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear inside her. "Because I can help you," the man said, his expression serious. "I know what you're looking for." Lila exchanged a glance with John, who gave a slight nod. "Let's hear him out," John said quietly. "But stay cautious." As they stepped inside the house, Lila knew that this was the moment they had been working toward, the moment when all the pieces of her past and her present would come together. It was a terrifying thought, but with John by her side, she felt a sense of resolve. Together, they could face anything. "Okay," she said, her voice steady as she sat down at the kitchen table across from the man who had once been a threat to her very existence. Let's talk. Lila sat across from the man, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read him. This was the man who had caused her so much pain, the one who had driven her to flee from her past. Now he was offering answers, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she should trust him. Why should we believe you? John's voice was calm, but guarded, his hands subtly resting on the chair leg, ready to react if necessary. The man looked from John to Lila, his gaze steady. Because I know more than you think, he said slowly, his voice low. I was there that night. It wasn't just random, Lila. They were looking for something, someone. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she leaned forward, her hands clenched on the table. What are you talking about? She demanded. What do they want? The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to John for a moment before returning to Lila. They were looking for you, Lila, he said softly. Or rather, they were looking for information you had. Information that was supposed to remain hidden. Hidden? Lila repeated, confusion etching her face. What do you mean? I've been following your trail, the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to get involved, but when I saw them coming for you again, I knew I had to step in. John leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Who are they? He asked, his tone sharp. And what do they want? The man glanced around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers before leaning closer. They're a group that deals in sensitive information, he said carefully. They thought you had something that belonged to them, something that could bring them power, wealth, control. Lila listened intently, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. And what does this have to do with me? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. What did I have that they wanted? Your past, the man replied. There's a file, documents, photos, everything from before you disappeared. It was stolen, and they believe you have it. They're after you because of it. John's eyes hardened as he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the man. And you're saying you can help us find it? The man nodded, his expression serious. Yes, but it's not going to be easy, he said slowly. The people who took it are ruthless. They won't stop until they get what they want. Lila looked at John, her heart pounding. Do we trust him? She'd asked quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. John studied the man for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I think we have to, he said firmly. We've come too far to back down now. Lila took a deep breath, feeling a knot of fear and hope mixed together in her stomach. Okay, she said finally, her voice steadying. Let's do this. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. Good, he said, his gaze meeting both of theirs. I know where the file is. Let's get it before they do. For the next few days, Lila, John, and the man who introduced himself as Sam worked together, tracking down leads and gathering information. It wasn't easy. Each step brought more danger, more questions, and more risks. But with John's strategic mind and Lila's determination, they were making progress. The final location was an old storage facility on the outskirts of town, hidden away in a maze of narrow streets and forgotten alleyways. It was there, Sam told them, that the file was being kept, a place so secret, even the people who had taken it didn't know its exact location. As they approached the facility, Lila's hands shook with nerves. This was it, the final test. If they could get in and find the file, they might finally have all the answers they needed. If not, they would be walking into a trap. Ready? John asked, his voice low as they stood at the entrance, their eyes scanning the area for signs of trouble. Ready, Lila replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Let's do this. They moved through the facility with precision, their footsteps silent on the concrete floors. Sam led them through a series of narrow corridors, his eyes darting around, checking for guards or security cameras. Lila and John stayed close behind, weapons ready just in case. Finally, they reached a small locked room at the end of one of the corridors. Sam stepped forward, his fingers working quickly on the lock. It clicked open with a soft snap, and he pushed the door open just enough for them to slip inside. The room was filled with files, boxes, and stacks of papers, evidence of the people who had been here before. Lila moved through the clutter, her heart pounding as she searched for the file they had come for. There, John said suddenly, pointing to a box in the far corner. That's it. Lila crossed the room quickly, her fingers trembling as she pulled the box down. Inside, she found the file, a thick stack of documents, photos, and hidden notes. As she flipped through it, her heart sank. It was everything they had been searching for. "This is it," she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked up at John and Sam. "We found it." John stepped closer, his eyes scanning the contents. "Good," he said softly. "Now we just need to figure out how to use it." As they sat in the storage room, surrounded by the evidence of Lila's past, they pieced together the story, the betrayal, the flight, and the people who had been trying to keep her from ever finding the truth. It wasn't just about the file. It was about the life Lila had lost, and the one she was trying to reclaim. "We can use this," Lila said finally, her voice steady. "To start over, to build a new life." John nodded, his gaze steady. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice serious. "But if anyone can do it, it's you." Lila took a deep breath, feeling a wave of determination wash over her. "Together," she said firmly, looking from John to Sam, "we can face anything." With the file in hand, they left the storage facility, stepping back into the world with a renewed sense of purpose. Lila knew that the past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to face the future, to start a new chapter with John by her side. As they walked away from the facility, the sun rising behind them, Lila felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She was finally free, free to be herself, free to live the life she had always dreamed of. And with John by her side, she knew that nothing could stop her now.